I considered being nice. I considered making this not a response video, but a standalone video essay without mentioning Hills Alive at all. I considered making it a nice response, wherein I give this creator the benefit of the doubt. But a certain chain of events made me reconsider my stance. The creator going by the name Hills Alive is causing actual damage, spewing actual reactionary rhetoric and holding actual reactionary views, which she then passes on to her impressionable audience. Hills Alive is a video essayist focusing on A Song of Ice and Fire, and some of her videos became the holy grail of a certain subgroup within that niche. Videos filled with unabashed slavery apologia. Hills Alive is also a confirmed Zionist who allegedly harassed actress Phoebe Tonkin to the point that she name-dropped her in one of her tweets. That was enough for me to discard all pretense of civility, and I will say it straight up. Hills Alive has no idea what she's talking about in practically every single one of her video essays, but particularly in her series about Daenerys Targaryen. Hills Alive's videos are like if you took all the bad faith readings of Dany seen on Reddit, Quora, and Westeros.org and made them into video essays. They do not only rely on apologizing for slavery, but also on malicious misreading of the text that, of course, nobody will bother to fact-check. Because we live in an era where it does not matter what happens in the text, the only thing that matters is what you want it to be, the headcanon industrial complex. Additionally, Hills Alive not only misrepresents the text and twists it to fit into her preconceived notions, she also is straight up lying on several occasions. So here is my response to Hills Alive. Enjoy. Instead of starting with the Misa is a Master series, I will instead start with the very first video mentioning Dany at all, and that is why was Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen's relationship so weird. There is nothing noteworthy about this video aside from the fact that it plants the seeds of Hills Alive's modus operandi, and it will be good for us to examine it before we move on towards more substantial productions.
Her next attempt at winning Jon's allegiance is even stranger. She claims that House Targaryen and House Stark were allies for centuries, when the obvious reality is that they were unwillingly subjugated by House Targaryen and the Iron Throne for the entire time. She also calls them centuries of peace and prosperity, which they very clearly and objectively were not. Westeros has never been particularly peaceful, but it's also never been as chaotic as it was during the reign of the Targaryens.
Now, this is the first instance of Hills Alive lying to her audience. This video was posted in December 2020 when Fire and Blood was already out for 2 years, and what is written in there directly contradicts the claim Hills Alive makes. Westeros has never been a peaceful place is an understatement that manages Hills Alive's argument to pass unnoticed. The 7 kingdoms of Westeros have been at constant war with one another. Hardly a year passed without some of them being at war. Aegon's chief concern was peace. Before the conquest, wars between the realms of Westeros were common. Hardly a year passed without someone fighting someone somewhere. Even in those kingdoms said to be at peace, neighboring lords oft settled their disputes at sword point. Aegon's accession put an end to much of that, though of course by the nature of feudalism itself, wars could never be fully eliminated. Instead of wars every single year, we only had 5 significant civil conflicts under the Targaryen rule, the Dance of the Dragons and 4 Blackfyre rebellions. Moreover, the Targaryens objectively brought prosperity and progress to Westeros. For the price of short-term violence, Aegon united the realm and stopped the constant wars. House of the Dragon also confirmed that the reason why Aegon did this was because he wished for the kingdom to be better united against the threat beyond the wall. Jaehaerys gave the kingdom 60 years of prosperity, which is a significant portion of the entire Targaryen rule. The accomplishments of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen were almost too many to enumerate. Chief among them, in the point of view of most students of history, are the long periods of peace and prosperity that mark his time upon the Iron Throne. Alysanne outlawed the law of the first night. And so it came to pass that the second of what the small folk named Queen Alysanne's laws was enacted, the abolition of the Lord's ancient right to the first night. Aegon III did his best to mend the wounds of the Dance of the Dragons, a devastating civil war which wasn't even started by the Targaryens but by the Hightowers. I mean to give the small folk peace and food and justice. Full bellies and dancing bears shall be my policy. The reign of the Targaryens was an improvement for Westeros, whether one likes them or not. House Targaryen and House Starks were indeed allies for centuries, and that becomes clear once again we read Fire and Blood. Now, I won't hold it against her, because the reveal about the Song of Ice and Fire happened very recently, but it is very likely that Torrhen Stark was aware of Aegon's dream. King Torrhen did send Brandon Snow across the Trident, but he crossed with 3 maesters by his side, not to kill but to treat. All through the night messages went back and forth. The next morning Torrhen Stark himself crossed the Trident. There, upon the south bank of the Trident, he knelt, laid the ancient crown of the Kings of Winter at Aegon's feet, and swore to be his man. But even if we discard that, then it is also clear that the deterioration of relations between Starks and Targaryens happened only because of Aerys Targaryen. For example, during the Dance of the Dragons, Cregan Stark stood firmly by Rhaenyra's side, and there's nothing to indicate that the relations were bad before Robert's rebellion. The claim of subjugation is also far-fetched. Not much has changed for the Starks following the unification of the kingdom. They regained practically all the autonomy over the north. The only thing that changed was that they were referred to as lords rather than kings. I wondered whether I should include this section at all, because this is a sort of snippet of an old video, and upon consideration I realized that yes, I should, because this shows the pattern of behavior that I see in all of Hill's Life's analysis. Notice how throughout this section we are only given official art and nebulous claims like Westeros was not peaceful before Targaryens, with the implication that after the Targaryens it was even worse. And it wasn't. Hills Alive does not cite her claims using Fire and Blood or any other canon source, because if she did, we would have a direct contradiction. Daenerys burning King's Landing is the favorite theory of everyone who hates Daenerys and the Targaryens, and for many years it has been considered a given that she will do exactly that in the Winds of Winter. The show canon seemed to cement this idea as well. People disagree on technicalities, whether she does it on purpose or by accident, but this theory has a wide following regardless.
George has already directly stated that the broad strokes of the ending will be the same in the books.
When? Because we are not shown any direct quote. The quote is not linked in the description either, even though there exists an entire search engine that would make it easy and quick to find it. The only thing about broad strokes that George R. R. Martin has ever said is that he had revealed to showrunners Benioff and Weiss the broad strokes of the ending. When HBO decided to make a TV series of George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and books, creator D.B. Weiss and David Benioff sat down with Martin and he told them how the story ends in broad strokes. But now that the show is catching up to Martin's books, he's told them in much greater detail, character by character. Now, revealing broad strokes and confirming that broad strokes will be the same are two different things, especially since D&D took so many creative liberties, cut so many characters and changed many storylines. For starters, there is absolutely no way that A Song of Ice and Fire ends with a Game of Thrones. The absolute final conflict of this series will undoubtedly be the struggle in the North. I fail to see why would Arya decide to sail west of Westeros if nothing in her story indicates that, and her struggle has always been to return to Winterfell. And I honestly have serious doubts about Daenerys' Mad Queen storyline. This is what George R.R. Martin had to say about the show ending right as Season 8 premiered. How will it end? I hear people asking. The same ending as the show? Different? Well, yes. And no. And yes. And no. And yes. And no. And yes. I am working in a very different medium that David and Dan, never forget. I had 6 hours for this final season. I expect these last 2 books of mine will fill 3,000 manuscript pages between them before I'm done. And if more pages and chapters and scenes are needed, I will add them. And of course the butterfly effect will be at work as well. Those of you who follow this Not a Blog will know that I've been talking about this since Season 1. There are characters who never made it onto the screen at all, and others who died in the show but still live in the books. So if nothing else, the readers will learn what happened to Jane Poole, Lady Stoneheart, Penny and her pig, Shaka's Shavepate, Arya Martell, Victarion Greyjoy, Sir Garland the Gallant, Aegon VI, and a myriad of other characters both great and small that viewers of the show never had the chance to meet. In fact, recently George R.R. Martin was very clear about the ending being different. However, when it comes to the Winds of Winter, Martin knows that it will ultimately stray from the television series. Most of you know by now that I do not like to give detailed updates on Winds, he wrote. I am working on it, I have been working on it, and I will continue to work on it. Still, he noted, what I have noticed more and more of late is my gardening is taking me further and further away from the television series. Yes, some of the things you saw on HBO in Game of Thrones, you will also see in the Winds of Winter, though maybe not in quite the same ways. But much of the rest will be quite different. That some aspects will be the same or similar does not indicate anything about broad strokes. And granted, this particular video was posted a year before George R.R. Martin made this particular claim, but the Not a Blog post from right after Season 8 premiered, 2 years before Hills Alive made this video, and anything about broad strokes was not said by George R.R. Martin. It was said by D&D, who claimed that they received broad strokes. Therefore, Hills Alive lies about George R.R. Martin claiming anything about broad strokes. This fact alone makes this entire argument invalid because it stems from assumptions that are inherently false.
There are a lot of theories about how Dany's dark, or at least darker, turn is going to go in the novels. Many fans, unsurprisingly, have come up with speculations that alleviate most of Dany's responsibility for the destruction of the city. But I think the notion that someone else will burn King's Landing, or that Daenerys will burn the capital by accident, are extremely unlikely.
Why is it extremely unlikely, considering that the show did not feature 2 characters who will be directly involved in the burning of the city, Euron Greyjoy and Jon Connington? The existence of these 2 players in how these events will unfold should have a significant effect. Actually, if anything, Daenerys burning King's Landing is less likely in the books because of the existence of Jon Connington, who has a specific trauma related to the sound of the bells, which for some reason are also Dany's trigger in the show, even though there is nothing that would release the trigger. This might indicate D&D trying to shoehorn these broad strokes.
And frankly, it has always been completely in character for Daenerys to justify any amount of devastation and destruction if it's in service of reclaiming the Iron Throne.
Can Hills Alive give at least one example of such a situation happening that isn't the burning of King's Landing, which was unnecessary anyway because the city was already conquered and these scenes existed just for shock value? I can give one, which was the battle in Season 7. I can also give several counter-arguments. Even in the show that portrayed Dany as more ambitious and ruthless, Daenerys was shown to prioritize the well-being of her people above her personal ambitions for the Iron Throne, which is why she remained in Meereen. She decided to help Jon fight against the others after she quite literally saved his life. She sacrificed half of her armies in order to defeat the Night King and almost died herself. Had Daenerys died in episode 3, the world would remember her as one of the biggest heroes of humanity.
Honestly, despite the fact that Game of Thrones retconned most of Dany's darkest book decisions and characteristics, even within the TV series itself, burning King's Landing was largely a logical extension of Dany's habit of killing anybody who gives even the slightest indication that they might not follow her.
I'm afraid that we have to classify this as another lie because again we are not given any examples. Which decision was retconned in the show? If anything, the show always made Daenerys more ruthless than she was in the books. We weren't given examples because if we were, Here's Alive would contradict herself, and you would know that she is lying to you. For example, Daenerys' decision to marry his daughter Lorak is all but enforced on her in the books because this seems to be the only way to stop the Harpy from killing the freedmen. Whereas in the show, she decides to randomly burn 2 slavers, force Hizdahr to watch, and then say that she is marrying him. A clear deviation from the books that positions her in a far more ruthless light. By the way, remember this screenshot. We will have a lot of fun with it later on.
It seems extremely likely that the omission of one significant character in the books, young Griff, will be one of the key differences in the destruction of King's Landing in the entire Targaryen dynasty. While I don't think young Griff's non-Targaryen heritage is nearly as undeniable as many other fans do, one thing that seems very probable is that regardless of whether or not Aegon is really Aegon Targaryen, Daenerys will not believe that he's the long-lost son of Rhaegar Targaryen.
Aegon is undeniably not a real son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, and it does not take rocket science to realize. Who exactly he is a matter of speculation, but the theory that I find the most convincing is that he is the son of Illyrio Mopatis and Serra, who is likely a descendant of the Blackfyres. I admire your powers of persuasion, Tyrion told Illyrio. How did you convince the Golden Company to take up the cause of our sweet queen when they have spent so much of their history fighting against the Targaryens? Illyrio brushed away the objection as if it were a fly. Black or red, a dragon is still a dragon. When Maerys the Monstrous died upon the stepstones, it was the end of the male line of House Blackfyre. Illyrio specifically says that the male line of the Blackfyres was extinguished, but leaves the matter of the female line unsaid, therefore subtly implying that the female line might indeed exist. However, as of yet, the biggest hint for his Blackfyre heritage is that he has the Golden Company by his side. The Golden Company was started by Aegor Rivers the Bittersteel, who was Daemon's Blackfyre's biggest supporter. And indeed, the Golden Company fought against legitimate Targaryens, and indeed Tyrion points this out, to which Illyrio Mopatis says, black or red, a dragon is still a dragon. And wouldn't you know, the heraldry of House Blackfyre is exactly the reversal of House Targaryen, a black dragon instead of red. He practically spelled it out for you. All that remains is to connect the dots. And when you couple this with the visions Daenerys has in the House of the Undying, it becomes clear that not only will Dany realize the truth about the Mummer's dragon, she will be the slayer of lies who will uncover this lie. Mother of dragons, daughter of death, glowing like sunset, a red sword was raised in the hand of the blue-eyed king who cast no shadow. A clothed dragon swayed on poles amidst a cheering crowd. From a smoking tower a great stone beast took wing, breathing shadow fire. Mother of dragons, slayer of lies. Yet the things I saw, a dead man in the prow of a ship, a blue rose, a banquet of blood. What does any of it mean, Khaleesi? A Mummer's dragon, you said. What is a Mummer's dragon, pray? A clothed dragon on poles, Dany explained. Mummers use them in their follies, to give the heroes something to fight.
But on the other hand, someone like young Griff, who has spent his entire life training to become the best king possible, seems like the kind of person who will likely win at least a significant amount of support among the lords of Westeros, and the common people, who at this point would honestly prefer anyone other than Cersei anyway. But if Dany arrives in Westeros, and there is a Targaryen who she doesn't believe is a Targaryen, already sitting on the Iron Throne with the backing of a multitude of kingdoms as well as the common people, clearly she's going to be pissed. And obviously, she's going to have a huge axe to grind with the boy who she believes has usurped her throne.
Here's Alive is entitled to thinking that he is real, though she is obviously wrong, but the reason why she holds this particular opinion is because it fits neatly into the predictions she has. Contrary to Hills Alive's statements given as fact, Daenerys in the book canon has no reason to hate Aegon. Quite the opposite. I know this is basically a given that people think that Daenerys will throw a temper tantrum once she learns of Aegon's existence, but there is nothing about her character that would indicate it. Quite the opposite. I think Daenerys will be overjoyed once she learns about Aegon. Daenerys agonizes over the fact that she is the last Targaryen alive. Daenerys agonizes that she will not be able to continue her line because of her alleged infertility. She felt very lonely all of a sudden. Mirri Maz Duur had promised that she would never bear a living child. House Targaryen will end with me. That made her sad. "You must be my children," she told the dragons. "My 3 fierce children. Arstan says dragons live longer than men. So we will go on after I am dead." And contrary to a popular belief, Daenerys sees seizing the Iron Throne as a matter of duty, not ambition. What Daenerys actually wants is a peaceful, stable life, represented by the house with the red door. Something is wrong, she knew at once. Is it Daario? What's happened? In her dream they had been man and wife, simple folk who lived a simple life, in a tall stone house with a red door. The sun was climbing up the sky and her people would soon be gathering. She would rather have drifted in the fragrant pool all day, eating ice fruit off silver trays, and dreaming of a house with a red door. But the queen belongs to her people, not to herself. Dany was willing to give Viserys her petrified dragon eggs in Book 1. His boots were dry and cracked, his silver blonde hair matted and tangled. A long sword swung from his belt in a leather scabbard. The Dothraki eyed the sword as he passed. Dany heard curses and threats and angry muttering rising all around her, like a tide. The music died away in a nervous stammering of drums. A sense of dread closed around her heart. "Go to him," she commanded Ser Jorah. "Stop him. Bring him here. Tell him he can have the dragon eggs if this is what he wants." I am fully convinced that she would be willing to give up the throne for young Griff, or help him get it simply as an exchange for having a family. At some point, Daenerys even thinks about the fact that she and Aegon would be of similar age, and that they would likely be married had he survived. 5 Aegons had ruled the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. There would have been a 6th, but the usurper's dogs had murdered her brother's son when he was still a babe at the breast. If he had lived, I might have married him. Aegon would have been closer to my age than Viserys. But she will inevitably realize that Aegon is not the real son of Rhaegar, and she will slay this lie. How this will happen, we can only speculate. Notice the key difference between me and Hills Alive. I am able to cite all my claims with relevant book passages, while Hills Alive makes claims and does not cite them in any way. Because if she did, she would have to contradict herself. Again. I will also make one petty argument. Aegon was not really trained to be the best king possible. That is an overstatement. I would say that it's closer to truth to say that he was molded into an idea of what the good king should be. But compared to Daenerys, who has actual experience ruling, he practically had everything handed to him on a silver platter, including but not limited to Illyrio sending sweets to him. There is a gift for the boy in one of the chests. Some candied ginger. He was always fond of it. Illyrio sounded oddly sad. I thought I might continue on Goyan Droch with you. A farewell feast before you start Dawn River. Illyrio was guiding him and protecting him this entire time, made sure that he was not in danger, and sent people to formally educate him. Daenerys had none of this. She received no formal education in any aspect, and is learning to rule by herself. Okay, finally back to the bells. Let us continue and see how big of a difference would the existence of 2 entire characters make in the version of events predicted by Hills Alive. Spoiler alert! As you can probably guess, the change can be reduced to "they are there."
While bells are a bit of a perennial theme within A Song of Ice and Fire, I think one particular bell-themed subplot might be the exact history that's going to repeat itself when King's Landing burns to the ground.
I had hoped that Hills Alive would pay attention to the bells and Jon Connington's connection to them, and she did. But her factoring of the bells into the broader context of the situation is, pardon me, laughably stupid.
And I think that Daenerys might defeat Aegon in the second Battle of the Bells. Jon Connington is another fantastic character who was completely omitted from the TV series, but it's interesting that the most fervent supporter of House Targaryen, who was on the front lines fighting for Rhaegar in Robert's Rebellion, seems to believe that the war wasn't actually lost in the Trident, but in Stony Sept when Jon failed to root out Robert Baratheon. Jon Conn's perspective on Rhaegar and on the entire war is undeniably warped. And in retrospect, House Targaryen's dynasty was always destined to fail. Rhaegar may not have had the violent impulses of Aerys, but a dude who lets the entire realm devolve into chaos because he really needs to impregnate a teenager who is dubiously consenting at best was not going to bring peace and prosperity back to the realm. And in a broader sense, the Targaryen values of isolationism, superiority, subjugation, and consolidation of power seem to indicate that no matter what happened, as long as the Targaryens stuck to their beliefs, then they were never going to hold on to the Seven Kingdoms.
Now, can Hills Alive give any example of isolationism, superiority, subjugation, and consolidation of power? Because I can certainly give counterexamples. Jaehaerys did indeed introduce the doctrine of exceptionality that allowed the Targaryens to marry brother to sister in order to keep the blood of the dragon, which is linked with their ability to tame dragons, but as the generations were passing, less and less Targaryens were practicing this, and more Targaryen children were actually discouraged from incest, perhaps because dragons were no longer around after the dance. Not only that, but House Targaryen has married into the following houses: Arryn, Hightower, Baratheon, Farman, Royce, Corbray, Plum, Manmoody, Dondarrion, Penrose, Velaryon, Blackwood, Martell, and Dane, directly contradicting any claims of isolationism or superiority. If the Targaryens felt superior to those houses, they would not be marrying them. Moreover, how does Hills Alive define subjugation? Whom did the Targaryens subjugate? There were several wars of succession, true, but that did not have anything to do with subjugating any particular group or a house. Dorne did not yield to the initial conquest, but joined the Seven Kingdoms peacefully and became a very pro-Targaryen place. What the conquest did was make the wars between kingdoms much less prominent, and Westeros finally progressed in some limited ways. For the Northmen, all that it did was change the nomenclature from king to lord. Additionally, Hills Alive does not mention why she believes House Targaryen is destined to fall. Like many of the things she says, she states something, does not cite any reasons for that. She expects you to take it as given, as if George R. R. Martin himself had already told us to be the case. I personally see no reason to believe that a house that will be crucial to defeating the others will fall just because some group of vocal people dislikes them. But anyway, this is yet another digression. We are going to the Bells Flight now with no excuses.
That he's almost certainly wrong. A Song of Ice and Fire has been pretty consistent in its portrayal of brutality. It has proven to be an effective tool in the short term, but it seems to have disastrous results in the long run. And, given that George R. R. Martin is an ardent pacifist, it's obvious that Jon Conn's belief that if only he had been crueler and more violent in Stony Sept, then the war would have been won for House Targaryen, is a belief that's bound to be undermined. The fact that Prince Aegon's greatest Westerosi supporter is so strong in this belief, though, seems to be an obvious setup for a clash in the future. It seems unlikely that the boy who Varys wanted to be the perfect king would be as brutal as someone like Tywin Lannister. And honestly, most people are not that violent, nor do they believe that the only goal is winning, no matter the cost. But it also seems to be a setup for a clash between young Griff and Daenerys.
Jon Connington believes that the Battle of the Bells was lost because he wasted time searching for Robert Baratheon instead of burning the Stony Sept and killing him here and there. If Robert burns alive in the Stony Sept, the battle in the Trident likely does not happen and Rhaegar survives, giving chances for the Loyalist forces to change the fate of war. Therefore, Jon Connington feels guilty over not being ruthless enough back then, and thinks to himself that he failed Rhaegar. But he won't fail someone of whom he thinks he is Rhaegar's son.
17 years had come and gone since the Battle of the Bells, yet the sound of the bells ringing still tied a knot in his guts. Others might claim that the realm was lost when Prince Rhaegar fell to Robert's warhammer on the Trident, but the Battle of the Trident would never have been fought if the Griffin had only slain the stag there in the Stony Sept. The bells tolled for all of us that day, for Aerys and his queen, for Elia of Dorne and her little daughter, for every true man and honest woman in the Seven Kingdoms, and for my Silver Prince.
And that is somehow a setup for a clash between young Griff and Daenerys.
Young Griff and Daenerys. After all, while most people wouldn't do absolutely anything to get what they believed was their birthright, Dany absolutely would. She internally justifies every action that she takes in service of getting the Iron Throne, and there doesn't seem to be a limit to the violence that she would excuse if it meant taking what she believes is rightfully hers.
Citation? Example? No? See, she does it again. She knows that her audience already believes what she believes, and as such, feels no need to convince anyone. I will count it as a lie then.
The descriptions of the Battle of the Bells in Jon Connington's POV chapters are all very interesting. And it's telling that even in these few glimpses into his mind, this battle is so vitally important. But Jon's memories are at their most interesting in the chapter The Griffin Reborn, when he discusses his failings with Miles Toyne. Jon tells himself that even Tywin Lannister couldn't have done anything more than what he did, but Toyne disagrees. Blackheart says, Lord Tywin would not have bothered with a search. He would have burned that town and every living creature in it. Men and boys, babes at the breast, noble knights and holy septons, pigs and whores, rats and rebels, he would have burned them all. When the fires guttered out and only ash and cinders remained, he would have sent his men in to find the bones of Robert Baratheon. And while Miles is undoubtedly right that this is exactly what Tywin Lannister would have done, the particular description of the violence sounds undeniably Targaryen in nature. It literally sounds like fire and blood.
Okay, so Hills Alive has someone saying that this is what Tywin Lannister would have done, and concludes that this is what a Targaryen would have done, specifically Daenerys.
And frankly, it sounds pretty close to what Daenerys did in Game of Thrones and is likely to do in King's Landing in A Song of Ice and Fire. Conceptually, it's actually quite simple. Jon Connington will fight the Battle of the Bells once again, except this time he's going to be on the side of the new Robert Baratheon. If young Griff is a remotely capable ruler who wins the hearts of the people, then it's entirely believable that the citizens of King's Landing would give him quarter when the Dragon Queen comes looking for him. And given Daenerys' typical patience level, it seems incredibly likely that Dany would just burn the traitors and find the bones of the usurper in the ashes. Jon Connington has returned to Westeros, operating under the belief that he's going to have to be tougher and more brutal to ensure that young Griff ascends to the Iron Throne like Rhaegar never did, and to ensure that he's never overthrown like the Mad King was. So then, it would be a pretty perfect twist of fate if everything that Jon believes now winds up being proven wrong, and he finds himself in the boy who he has vowed to defend to his last breath, relying on the kindness of strangers to hide them from the Targaryen ruler and her armies who are searching for them. And ironically, Jon will not do what he has set out to do, succeed for the son where he failed for the father, precisely because the enemy that he's facing now will be ready and willing to use the brutality that Jon Con originally shied away from in the Stony Sept. If young Griff and the Elder Griffin were actually dealing with a rival who was similar to the younger Jon Connington, someone who wasn't willing to wreak havoc and destruction in order to find their enemy at all costs, then they might have had a chance at least surviving. But, because Dany is the type of person who serves up fire and blood to anyone she thinks even might be her enemy, any of King Aegon's protectors will be treated with the brutality that Jon currently believes is necessary to win. And young Griff will be killed anyway. And of course, while Daenerys will almost certainly win the battle against Aegon VI, her decision to be as violent and swift as possible in order to root out her enemies will also lead to her ultimate downfall and a truly irrevocable end to the Targaryen dynasty. Thematically, the repetition of past mistakes, the false belief that great violence in service of a supposedly greater good is worthwhile, and the false belief that brutality is strength, all fits well with A Song of Ice and Fire and George R.R. Martin's political point of view. But obviously, given that Aegon Targaryen, Jon Connington, and their entire branch of the story was omitted in Game of Thrones, none of this could have ever happened in the TV series. And perhaps the title of the penultimate episode was a subtle nod to the climax that the writers know will be coming in the books.
So Daenerys is shoehorned into this scenario based on what we've seen in the show, on the premise that George said something about broad strokes, which he didn't. So this argument is automatically invalid. Now, what if we remove Daenerys from this situation entirely and take into account Jon Con's grief and regrets over not being ruthless like Tywin, combined with the wildfire that Aerys left beneath the King's Landing, as well as his trauma related to the sound of the bells? In this scenario, for reasons unknown as of yet, Jon Con hears the sound of the bell and decides to be ruthless and to burn King's Landing. But he doesn't know about wildfire. In this scenario, we also have Cersei, who is obsessed with wildfire, so this is even more deadly. Young Griff likely dies in this scenario. To me, it makes infinitely more sense than playing into Jon Con's apparent delusions of House Targaryen, and Daenerys just wanting to kill the only person she believes to be her remaining family member. But in order to force Dany into this narrative, Hills Alive creates a scenario that does not make any sense, ignoring Jon Con's fundamental characterization that she has a surface level appreciation of. Not to mention that I'm pretty sure she doesn't even take into the account that there is wildfire beneath King's Landing. If anyone nukes the city, it's going to be Griff or Cersei. Whether Daenerys will ever be present during this event is honestly questionable. Firstly, the video title itself posits that someone will kill Daenerys Targaryen. That by itself is a manipulation already, but let us continue.
George R.R. Martin has already directly stated that the broad strokes of Game of Thrones' ending matches his planned conclusion for A Song of Ice and Fire.
And wouldn't you know, Hills Alive lies again about the broad strokes, and once again does not give a link to George saying anything of this sort. This is a very crude sort of manipulation. Since Hills Alive relies on her audience being too lazy to actually check whatever she says. They watch these video essays because they already believe what she believes and simply need some surface level lies passed off as analysis to confirm it and share it when necessary.
Sure, There are plenty of connections between Jon and Dany in the novel narrative, and their fundamentally opposed perspectives about being a Targaryen is undoubtedly going to be a vital aspect of the story. Especially if Lyanna's relationship with Rhaegar isn't as loving as Game of Thrones would have viewers believe. And especially if Jon thinks that Daenerys is going to be at war with his brother Aegon. And to be fair...
Now, this is yet another very nice euphemism that conceals the truth just well enough for the not too meticulous audience to ignore. But the reality is, Daenerys and Jon don't just have a connection. Their stories mirror each other ever since Book 1 and have a deep bond even before they meet. They have been paralleled with one another since the very beginning of the story. Jon and Daenerys are both outcasts. Jon is an illegitimate child while Dany is an exiled princess. Both of them are thrown into cultures that at first they don't understand and fear, but eventually grow accustomed and even start loving it. Dany with the Dothraki and Jon with wildlings. Both of them become leaders in their own right. Both of them are revolutionary in their leadership. Jon makes peace with the wildlings and Dany fights against slavery. Hills Alive never mentions any of this and instead focuses on what she thinks will happen in the following books, with a hyper-focus on how will Jon react to his secret Targaryen identity, with an implication that, of course, he will not be happy about it, without explaining why would this, of all things, be the focal point of this realization, and not, the fact that he was loved and wanted, and that the person he perceived as his father was not. And there is of course the mention of an absolutely unfounded theory that young Griff is legitimate and that Jon will have reasons to just blindly side with him rather than Dany, but we already shredded that to pieces.
This is undeniably a bit of a tinfoil hat theory, but the first hint at this potential conclusion for Daenerys and the entire Targaryen line actually came towards the end of the Game of Thrones novel. Just before Dany brings dragons back into the world, she makes a speech to the followers that she has left. And interestingly, when she's lauding her Targaryen heritage, she mentions that she's the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel. Now, clearly the fact that she's referencing Maegor the Cruel of all people doesn't seem like a great sign of what's to come. But after further consideration, the fact that she mentions Aegon and Maegor and no one else is incredibly strange.
Has Hills Alive lied here? Daenerys does bring up Maegor the Cruel, but in a different situation. She does this when she learns about the fact that Eroe, a Lazaran girl she promised herself to protect, was gang-raped by the Dothraki and then killed by Mago. Dany promises herself that she will avenge Eroe. "It was her fate, Khaleesi," said Aggo. "If I look back, I am lost." "It was a cruel fate," Dany said, "yet not so cruel as Mago's will be. I promise you that, by the old gods and the new, by the Lamb God and the Horse God and every other god that lives. I swear it by the Mother of Mountains and the Womb of the World. Before I am done with them, Mago and Kojako will plead for the mercy they showed Eroe." The Dothraki exchanged uncertain glances. "Khaleesi," the handmaid Iri explained, as if to a child. "Jaqo is a Khal now, with 20,000 riders at his back." She lifted her head. "And I am Daenerys Stormborn, Daenerys of House Targaryen, of the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel, and old Valyria before them. I am the dragon's daughter, and I swear to you, these men will die screaming." She invokes Maegor and his cruelty because she promises to delay Maegor-type cruelty to the man who raped Eroe twice and then killed her. She does this because she feels extremely frustrated and heartbroken over this situation. Now, this probably does not matter to Hills Alive, because Hills Alive does not think Daenerys would ever be justified in avenging a slave, which we will discuss later. But she did make this argument based on one line, and one that she got wrong anyway. Dany does not say this right before she goes into the pyre, so the context in which she said this is completely different. So Hills Alive lied again, and her audience did not catch it because 1. She does not provide citation for her claims, 2. They are too lazy to fact-check themselves. And this is how all the misconceptions are passed further. By the way, Daenerys is not really a descendant of Maegor since he had no children, and she comes from Aenys' line, but this is a digression.
Although this is a relatively brief moment in the books, and thus may not be representative of Daenerys' arc as a whole, this entire sequence of events where the dragons are born is essentially the very start of Dany claiming what she sees as her birthright as a reigning Targaryen dragon queen in her own right. So the importance of what she says here definitely shouldn't be underestimated.
And yes, Hills Alive doubles down with claiming that mentioning Maegor is significant because it happens in the context of the birth of the dragons, even though it does not happen then. And so that is enough to throw this entire argument into the dustbin. The developed world to which Hills Alive belongs to, since she is American, prides itself in its literacy, but there is a big problem with something called functional illiteracy, which is being able to read but not comprehend what is being read. It is estimated that 40% of Americans might be functionally illiterate. But wait, the video is not over. Who else could kill Daenerys, since Hills Alive is so convinced that someone must?
The Faceless Men are clearly the most notorious assassins in A Song of Ice and Fire. But even aside from that, the fact that they allegedly began as rebel slaves in the Valyrian Freehold, and the fact that they're based in Braavos, the famously anti-dragon and anti-Valyrian free city, makes it seem likely that Maegor is exactly the kind of person that they'd want to kill.
Well, Hills Alive manipulates her audience once more. How this time? Firstly, the theory that Maegor was killed by the Faceless Men is very far-fetched. Yes, Braavos, where the Faceless Men were born, was founded as an anti-Valyrian, anti-dragon city. But why would Braavos be so personally invested in the affairs of Westeros to get involved solely on the basis of their anti-Valyrian stances? If anything, the Faceless Men have to rid themselves of any personal feelings or emotions if they ever hope to succeed in their training. If anything, it's more reasonable to assume that someone hired the Faceless Men, and the true mystery is who exactly did that. I personally think that Maegor might have committed suicide, or that indeed the throne rejected him, but it is extremely unlikely that the Faceless Men were involved, and even if they were, it wasn't on her own volition. Now continuing towards Arya.
And if there is any connection between Maegor's end and Dany's, then clearly there's only one Faceless Man, or Faceless Girl, who is truly appropriate for the job. One aspect of Game of Thrones that confused me at the very end was that, frankly, I couldn't understand how Arya and Daenerys could ever come face to face without Arya wanting to kill Dany.
Arya has absolutely no reason to hate or want to kill Daenerys. In the show's season 2, which is quite faithful to the books, there is a scene of Arya explicitly giving praise to Visenya.
That's why every child alive still knows his name, 300 years after his death.
Aegon and his sisters.
Huh?
It wasn't just Aegon riding his dragon. It was Rhaenys and Visenya too.
Correct. Student of history, are you?
Rhaenys rode Meraxus. Visenya rode Vhagar.
I'm sure I knew that when I was a boy.
Visenya Targaryen was a great warrior. She had a Valyrian steel sword she called Dark Sister.
She's a heroine of yours, I take it.
Then there's this scene in Feast where kindly men and Arya discuss the origins of Faceless Men. All gods have their instruments, men and women who served them and helped them to work their will on earth. The slaves were not crying out to 100 different gods, as it seemed, but to one god with 100 different faces. And he was the god's instrument. That very night he chose the most wretched of the slaves, the one who had prayed most earnestly for his release, and freed him from his bondage. The first gift had been given. Arya drew back from him. He killed the slave! That did not sound right. He should have killed the masters. He should have killed the masters. And guess what Daenerys is doing right now? If anything, Daenerys is someone that Arya would admire. Someone who brings justice to the common people who suffer in the games of the nobles.
They have one of the strongest foil dynamics in the books, and even in the TV series. And considering that Arya isn't exactly conservative when it comes to killing whoever tickles her fancy, the notion that she could meet anyone who she would perceive as a direct threat to her family or to society at large, and not kill them, was odd.
And Daenerys has never posed a threat to Arya's family. Not in the books, not in the show. Quite the opposite. Daenerys gave up her pursuit for the throne and was one of the saviors of humanity, including, who didn't you know, Arya and her family in their ancestral seat.
What makes Arya such a compelling foil for Daenerys is that Arya has experienced war in the exact opposite manner that Daenerys will create it. Arya knows what it's like to be on the ground with the common people, in the dirt, seeing the men being disemboweled and beheaded, the women beaten and exploited, and the children orphaned and left to die. She walks through the aftermath of war horrors, that, incredibly ironically, are being carried out in the supposedly just and honorable service of avenging and protecting the Starks. Arya is constantly traumatized by simply experiencing a war that is being partially fought in her name in the same way that every normal person in Westeros experiences it.
Daenerys also experiences the pains of the common people, except it happens in Slaver's Bay rather than in Westeros. Daenerys sees the horrors that are inflicted not on feudal peasants, who are at least nominally free, but on slaves, who are objects to be bought and sold. Let us see a small sample of the horrors that slave masters inflict on the people of Essos. "They are chosen young, for size and speed and strength," the slave told her. "They begin their training at 5. Every day they train from dawn to dusk, until they have mastered the short sword, the shield, and the 3 spears. The training is most rigorous, Your Grace. Only 1 boy in 3 survives it. This is well known. Among the Unsullied it is said that on the day they win their spiked cap, the wars is done with, for no duty that will ever fall to them could be as hard as their training." Krasnys Monaclos supposedly spoke no word of the common tongue, but he bobbed his head as he listened, and from time to time gave the slave girl a poke with the end of his lash. "Tell her that these have been standing here for a day and a night, with no food nor water. Tell her that they will stand until they drop if I should command it, and when 999 have collapsed to die upon the bricks, the last will stand there still, and never move until his own death climbs him. Such is their courage. Tell her that." "Your worship." The eunuch stood, and Krasnys Monaclos slid the sword slowly up his torso, leaving a thin red line across his belly and between his ribs. Then he jabbed the sword point in beneath a white pink nipple and began to work it back and forth. "What is he doing?" Dany demanded of the girl as the blood ran down the man's chest. "Tell the cow to stop her bleeding," said Krasnys without waiting for the translation. "This will do him no great harm. Men have no need of nipples, eunuchs even less so." The nipple hung by the thread of a skin. He slashed and sent it tumbling to the bricks, leaving behind a round red eye, copiously weeping blood. The eunuch did not move, until Krasnys offered him back his sword, hilt first. "Here, I'm done with you. This one is pleased to have served you." Those who cannot are called in training, along with those who cannot run all day in full pack, scale a mountain in the black of night, walk across a bed of coals, or slay an infant. Dany's mouth surely twisted at that. Did he see, or is he blind as well as cruel? She turned away quickly, trying to keep her face and mask until she heard the translation. Only then did she allow herself to say, "Whose infants do they slay?" To win his spiked cap, an Unsullied must go to the slave marts with a silver mark, find some walling newborn, and kill it before its mother's eyes. In this way we make certain that there is no weakness left in them. She was feeling faint. The heat, she tried to tell herself. You take a babe from its mother's arms, kill it as she watches, and pay for her pain with a silver coin? When the translation was made for him, Krasnys Monaclos laughed aloud. "What a soul-mulling fool this one is! Tell the whore of Westeros that the mark is for the child's owner, not the mother. The Unsullied are not permitted to steal." He tapped his whip against his neck. "Tell her that few ever fail this test. The dogs are harder for them, it must be said. We give each boy a puppy on the day that he is cut. At the end of the first year, he is required to strangle it. Any who cannot are killed and fed to the surviving dogs. It makes for a good strong lesson, we find." But I'm sure that Hills Alive doesn't care about it, because she is on the side of slave owners. "Oh yeah, we are going there."
This is almost completely contrasted with Dany's journey. When she joins the Dothraki, a significant aspect of her experience with them is essentially ignoring the realities of what violence they can bring to the world around them. At one point, she sums this up perfectly when she specifically thinks to herself. She rode at the head of the Khalasar with Drogo and his blood riders, so she came to each country fresh and unspoiled. Behind them the great horde might tear the earth and muddy the rivers and send up clouds of choking dust, but the fields ahead of them were always green and verdant. This seems like a pretty apt description of Daenerys' entire conquest, as it has happened thus far, and as it will happen in the future.
Can someone bring up to Hills Alive's attention that the Dothraki leave nothing behind themselves because Drogo's Khalasar is gigantic? It is counted within hundreds of thousands of people who will obviously trample the grass, cut trees to start fires, and hunt for animals. And Daenerys is aware of this, she mentions it.
But because she rides at the front with the leader, she won't see it.
But it's also an incredibly vital insight into Dany's perspective and the way she intentionally tries to see things. Because Daenerys has caused an astounding amount of chaos and suffering in the books already, but she's not entirely without empathy. Unsurprisingly, if she sees horrors unfolding right in front of her, she can sympathize with the victims and often wants to do something about it. But what makes her an incredibly dangerous person is that she has the option of separating herself from the violence that she inflicts on others, and she very often chooses to do that. And as she gets more and more experience with the dragons, that's only going to get worse. The dragons are a fantastic plot device, because they function in so many different ways. And obviously, the most important function that they serve for Dany is giving her near absolute military power.
Notice how this is all an assumption about what Daenerys will do. Not did, but will do. She is the only character in A Song of Ice and Fire who is judged for something she has not yet done. And that assumption relies entirely on Hills Alive apparently believing her own line about George R. R. Martin admitting that the broad strokes will be the same in the books. Therefore, every single video Hills Alive does on this subject is automatically wrong, because they stem from false assumptions. But finally, the moment that we have all waited for is unfolding. We are reaching the Hills Alive slavery apologia, and while previously I was at worst ironic, here I intend to be as bitchy as physically possible. And I will start talking to Hills Alive directly, in the second person singular, since we reached a point where she no longer deserves respect or cuddling. Because for you, to turn towards slavery apologism, in the year of 2023 Anno Domini, while being a white American, who may as well descend from actual owners of black slaves, because you hate a character in a fantasy show, and that hatred stems from you twisting the text to fit whatever you want it to be, while lying to your audience, is something I will not tolerate. And it's about time that someone says this to you directly.
It's very hard not to have some level of empathy for Daenerys throughout the entirety of the first book, because she suffers horrendously and it's obvious that she has been suffering for a great while before the audience ever meets her. However, the nature of reading through her point of view has a way of masking the darker realities of the choices that she makes from the jump. And it largely obscures the fact that from the moment Daenerys decided to be queen, she also decided that villainy was a worthy price for power.
It is very important that you intentionally make a nebulous claim once more in order to mud the waters, because if you said anything beyond Daenerys suffered a lot, you would have to be faced with obvious reality that throughout all of A Game of Thrones, Daenerys has virtually no agency whatsoever because she is sold to Drogo as a child bridal slave, and she remains that slave up until the moment Drogo dies. Any power she possesses is also being granted to her graciously by her pedophile rapist husband. She never stops being a slave, she never stops thinking of herself as being sold, even after her Stockholm syndrome causes her to fall in love with Drogo. He was too eloquent for her. Dany had no answer for him, only the raw feeling in her belly. Slavery is not the same as rain, she insisted. I have been rained on, and I have been sold. It is not the same. No man wants to be owned. But I guess we only care about certain child brides, right?
Now, it's easy to miss one of the key elements of this exchange, but it really feels like a vital insight into Dany's perspective at this moment. Dany begs Mirri to save Drogo, and offers Mirri her freedom if she does so successfully. To be clear, Mirri Maz Duur is a middle-aged woman who was free up until a few days ago, and unless she failed to mention it, she has never been a slave before. She was enslaved and brutally, repeatedly raped as a captive, specifically in service of Dany's quest for the Iron Throne, and that is a price that Dany was actively willing to let others pay for her benefit. As she sees the horror of the sacking around her, she literally thinks to herself, this is war. This is what it looks like. This is the price of the Iron Throne.
Now, you at the very least actually cite the books to back your claims. That is a progress. Except you intentionally leave out whatever may make your claim not hold up. May I remind you, Daenerys is at this point a naive, 14-year-old bridal slave who at first tries to rationalize the violence around her, but as soon as she witnesses too much, she puts an end to it as best as she can in the position that she is in. Like 5 lines later. She wanted to cry, but she told herself that she must be strong. This is war. This is what it looks like. This is the price for the Iron Throne. I've told the Khal he ought to make for Meereen, Ser Jorah said. They will pay a better price than he would get from a slaving caravan. Illyrio writes that they had a plague last year, so the brothers are paying double for healthy young girls and triple for boys under 10. If enough children survive the journey, the god will buy us all the ships we need and hire men to sail them. Behind them, the girl being raped made a heart-rending sound, a long sobbing wail that went on and on and on. Dany's hand clenched hard around the reins, and she turned the Silver's head. Make them stop, she commanded Ser Jorah. Khaleesi, the knight sounded perplexed. You heard my words, she said. Stop them. She spoke to her Khas in the harsh accent of Dothraki. Drogo Quaro, you will aid Ser Jorah. I want no rape.
Mirri Maz Duur was a free woman who suffered horrendously while being forced into subjugation, and her master has agreed to free her if and only if she saves the man who led the destruction of her entire community. In order to get back what she already had, she has to serve the two people who were the entire driving force behind her slavery and suffering in the first place.
You call Daenerys Mirri's master, even though she herself is still a 14-year-old pregnant bridal slave, and all the power that she has, she gets from pleasing her husband sexually. Yet you insist on positioning a slave child bride as an equal master to Drogo, something that you would never do if this was about some other child bride that you selectively care about because she fits more into your ideas of proper womanhood. And because it fits your general narrative, you will call a pregnant 14-year-old bridal slave who was sold in order to be raped a slave master.
Another one of their exchanges seems to offer even more insight into this unsettling dynamic. Mirri says, "It is not a matter of gold or horses. This is blood magic, lady. Only death may pay for life." Death. Dany wrapped her arms around herself protectively, rocked back and forth on her heels. My death? She told herself she would die for him, if she must. She was the blood of the dragon, she would not be afraid. Her brother Rhaegar had died for the woman he loved. No, Mirri Maz Duur promised. Not your death, Khaleesi. Dany trembled with relief. Do it. Now, there is arguably something admirable and brave about Dany's willingness to offer herself up as a sacrifice. But it's more than a little disturbing that once Mirri says that Dany isn't the one who has to die, she simply says, do it. Firstly, that seems like the kind of scenario that requires some follow-up questions. But secondly, it seems to indicate that Dany is willing to use someone else as a sacrifice to save Drogo. This isn't a particularly shocking revelation given that the Dothraki have a larger than average appetite for slaughter. But it's also incredibly grim that Dany is willing to kill someone else, anyone else, in order to save her warlord husband.
Immediately after that, Maggie tricks Dany into believing that the price for Drogo's survival is that of a horse. The Maegi nod solemnly. As you speak, so it shall be done. Call your servants. Khal Drogo writhed feebly as Rakharo and Quaro lowered him into the bath. No, he muttered. No, must ride. Once in the water, all the strength seemed to leak out of him. Bring his horse, Mirri Maz Duur commanded, and so it was done. Drogo led the great red stallion into the tent. When the animal caught the scent of death, he screamed and reared, rolling his eyes. It took 3 men to subdue him. What do you mean to do? Dany asked her. We need the blood, Mirri answered. This is the way. And God Almighty, this isn't Daenerys willing to spill blood for her own desires. The desire in question is to stay alive. Again, if you hadn't already noticed, this is a 14-year-old pregnant bridal slave who knows full well that all her power derives from Drogo, and without Drogo, she is at the complete mercy of the Khalasar. At that point, not only Dany's life depends on it, but also the lives of the women she claimed in order to save them from further suffering. You know, the ones you call the slaves of this 14-year-old bridal slave. And wouldn't you know, once Drogo dies, and the power struggle begins in the Khalasar, only Jorah's protection is what saves Dany from death. But Dany losing all of her power because Drogo no longer leads the Khalasar is what causes Eroeh to be gang-raped and murdered. Daenerys at 14 years old is perceptive and intelligent enough to be aware of this. This is why she tries to save Drogo as best as she can. Not every character can be as advanced in her thinking processes. For example, a certain one, who is only 2 years younger, had no problem in ratting out her father's plans to the queen she knew is evil, because she killed her wolf, which resulted in said father's death and the downfall of her house. At the very least, we are back at unfounded claims rather than lying.
Daenerys is understandably gutted when she realizes that Drogo is essentially the living dead, and after accusing Mirri Maz Duur of tricking her, Mirri comes as close as she ever does to outright admitting that she did this on purpose. Much of what she says and doesn't say here is incredibly interesting, but one particular line stands out. When the seas go dry and mountains blow in the wind like leaves, when your womb quickens again and you bear a living child, then he will return and not before. What is still very telling about this entire exchange is that while what Mirri says seems to be quite pointedly brutal towards Dany and her childish, self-centered view of what has been done to her and her people, Mirri never actually says that she has done any of this intentionally. She never actually admits to the crime that Dany seems to be accusing her of. And that is in addition to the fact that there is considerable evidence pointing to the possibility that none of this was Mirri's actual intentions.
Such as? You immediately move to another point because there is no such evidence. Mirri Maz Duur does admit to it. You warned me that only death could pay for life. I thought you meant the horse. No, Mirri Maz Duur said. That was a lie you told yourself. You knew the price. Mirri Maz Duur explicitly admits that it was Rhaego whose death was used to pay for Drogo's life. Jorah entering the tent is likely what caused Rhaego's deformity, but not him. That Mirri does not say, yes, I killed Rhaego in this and that way is irrelevant. If you don't see this obvious admission of guilt, then let's look at how this scene was depicted in the show.
You have gold, whatever you want.
It's not a matter of gold, this is blood magic. Only death pays for life.
My death.
No, not your death, Khaleesi. Bring me his horse. No, not your death, Khaleesi. Bring me his horse. Bring me his horse.
However, the question of what Mirri Maz Duur did or did not do quickly becomes irrelevant. The story quickly hurtles towards arguably the most important moment of Dany's life, and Mirri Maz Duur is bound to the pyre and burned alive in the great fire that brings dragons back into the world. And because these twists and turns are so shocking, it's easy to lose track of what is actually happening here. Because, while Dany makes a point of freeing all of the slaves that are left in her caravan before putting herself on the pyre, she does not ever free Mirri. The evidence of Mirri's crimes are pretty tenuous, so in the most positive reading of this scenario, Daenerys is burning her slave alive for rebelling against her master. And in the worst, Daenerys is burning her slave alive for something that she didn't even do.
Firstly, Mirri is not Dany's slave, and Mirri did not simply act out against her master, because Daenerys is not her master, as we already established. Secondly, the books make it clear that Daenerys does not burn Mirri for disobedience or as revenge, but because Mirri's life is necessary to perform a ritual that brings dragons back to life. Another obvious thing that misses people entirely because they are hell-bent on misinterpreting Dany's character. The God's wife did not cry out as they dragged her to Khal Drogo's pyre and stacked her down amidst his treasures. Dany poured it all over the woman's head herself. I thank you, Mirri Maz Duur, she said, for the lessons you have taught me. You will not hear me scream, Mirri responded as the oil dripped from her hair and soaked her clothing. I will, Dany said. But it is not your screams I want, only your life. I remember what you told me. Only death can pay for life. Mirri Maz Duur opened her mouth but made no reply. As she stepped away, Dany saw that the contempt was gone from Maegi's flat black eyes. In its place was something that might have been fear. No, she did not just do whatever. She figured out what her ancestors could not. This was all intentional. And thirdly, let me get a bit personal here. I never had much of a parental instinct. As of now, I don't plan to have children. However, due to various circumstances of my life, my family history and other experiences that I had, I was convinced very early in my life that there is no love in this world stronger than that of a parent towards their children. And I can tell you, with full certainty, that if someone killed my child in my womb, I would not be half as merciful as Dany was. I would skin this motherfucker alive, while pouring salt on each and every one of his wounds, and after he dies in the biggest possible agony, I would whack his corpse into pieces.
It's very easy to get caught up in Dany's POV trap in many ways, but one of the biggest traps is that because she sees herself as the world's main character, the reader or viewer immediately assumes that she must be right.
You know, there actually is a character who, by the author himself, to be an unreliable narrator, and that is Sansa Stark. And I know this because I don't have to make up things George R.R. Martin said in order to further my agenda. George R.R. Martin actually says that it's Sansa who has lapses in memory. The Lion's Paw, Lion's Tooth business, on the other hand, is intentional. A small touch of the unreliable narrator. I was trying to establish that the memories of my viewpoint characters are not infallible. Sansa is simply remembering it wrong. A very minor thing. You are the only one to catch it to date. But it was meant to set the stage for a much more important lapse in memory. You will see in A Storm of Swords and later volumes that Sansa remembers the Hound kissing her that night he came to her bedroom. But if you look at that scene, he never does. That will eventually mean something, but just now it's a subtle touch, something most of the readers might not even pick up on. And also it is Sansa who believes herself to be the main character of the story. At the beginning of A Game of Thrones, she is an hard-headed idiot who thinks that life is just like the stories she likes, and she is going to be the main character of one, that Joffrey is a gallant prince, whose good queen she will be. And even after witnessing Joffrey threatening to mutilate a lowborn boy, she closes her eyes to his cruelty. And even after Cersei demands that her wolf gets killed, Sansa still blames Arya and is still stupid enough to believe that she can trust Cersei because she is a beautiful queen and all beautiful queens in her dumbass stories are good. So I would think twice before I make such judgments.
If Mirri Maz Duur did whatever she could to undermine Daenerys and Drogo, if she went out of her way to do harm to them, she would still be in the right. Again, we're talking about a master-slave relationship. So to claim that Mirri has no right to harm them or kill them would mean that a slave has no right to rebel against their master.
This particular video is much longer, but I feel like stopping here, because this seems like the best moment to go to the actual point of this video. Because no, you don't believe that slaves have the right to rebel.
Dany's conquest throughout Slaver's Bay is one of the most narratively rich and complex storylines within the entire series, and her liberation of these slave cities seems to be pretty straightforward on its face. However, there are some really interesting depths to these moments in the story that actually seem to reveal a lot about Daenerys as a leader that she doesn't even necessarily recognize about herself. And that is especially true about Dany's decision to crucify 163 slave masters in Meereen. Dany's choices here aren't particularly confusing, nor are they difficult to understand, and it's clear why George R.R. Martin set them up in this way. Daenerys' quest to free the slaves of Essos is undeniably a noble goal, and Dany's treatment of many of the slave masters that she encounters isn't particularly surprising. And her decision to crucify the masters as a punishment for the mutilated children that greeted her on her way to Meereen is especially easy to relate to and comprehend. This specific narrative trickery that George R.R. Martin uses is honestly one of his best, because the entire setup for this situation invites the reader to take absolutely everything at face value and question almost nothing about what Dany decides to do.
Because there is nothing to question here. People who owned human beings like they are things killed 163 children and crucified them just as a display of power. This is one of the most brutal acts in the entire book series, and that is already saying something. And not only that, it is done against defenseless children. Not that long ago you argued that Daenerys does not witness war the way Arya does. What else would you call this if not exactly that? I guess war atrocities only count if they are done against Westerosi.
Even though Dany herself seems to hint at some misgivings for her decision to crucify the Masters, this eye for an eye punishment is completely comprehensible and easy to empathize with, and it positions Daenerys as a righteous arm of somewhat brutal justice towards nameless, faceless characters that are basically indefensible. On the surface, there is almost nothing complex or even worth questioning about this scenario, but that's what makes the subtext of this entire event even more interesting and informative. Again, the setup here is so overtly good versus evil that it essentially discourages the audience from questioning it whatsoever. Killing people who have enslaved, abused, mutilated, and murdered countless people for their own profit is not something anyone will ever be inclined to argue against, especially when they were possibly involved in or complicit with the horrific, brutal murders of children.
And yet, you made a 15-minute long video doing exactly that. Because that's what you do.
It's fascinating that the entire event is framed as a very one-for-one form of justice against the slave masters for their cruelty towards the children. It is literally 163 slave masters crucified for the 163 children that Daenerys counted and witnessed along the roads towards Meereen. But, while it seems to be some sort of an equal exchange, these actions and punishments are anything but true justice. A Storm of Swords, Daenerys 6, includes this incredibly informative passage. In the plaza before the Great Pyramid, the Meereenese huddled forlorn. The great masters had looked anything but great in the morning light. Stripped of their jewels and their fringed tokars, they were contemptible. A herd of old men with shriveled balls and spotted skin, and young men with ridiculous hair. Their women were either soft and fleshy or as dry as old sticks, their face paint streaked by tears. I want your leaders, Dany told them. Give them up, and the rest of you shall be spared. How many? One old woman had asked, sobbing. How many must you have to spare us? 163, she answered. She had them nailed to wooden posts around the plaza, each man pointing at the next. While Dany's decision-making is incredibly simple and easy to understand, there are a lot of fascinating and terrifying things happening here that say a lot about how Dany views justice and how dangerous her perspective on fair rule really is. The first and most obvious issue is ironically not Dany's punishment, but her supposed mercy. Dany takes 163 leaders and doles out the punishment towards them, and spares the rest. However, we and she have no idea who is actually responsible for the heinous acts committed against the children, and it is a near guarantee that there weren't exactly 163 masters who were personally responsible for the 163 crucified children. So what that essentially means is that regardless of whether or not Daenerys over or undershot the number of people who were culpable in these acts, the alleged justice that was served in some form of retribution for the children was anything but just.
If they are leaders, then they are complicit in this act. And even if they weren't, they were slavers who benefited from the system that killed these children in the first place. They owned human beings as property. The mere fact of being a slaver is an immoral one. Even if you are the best slave master possible. I'm gonna be real with you. I don't give a single flying fuck as to whether some people in the 163 were just innocent slavers. They got what they deserve because, I don't know, they owned human beings as property. And while you make all sorts of convoluted arguments as to them not being personally responsible for the crucifixion of children, are you seriously thinking that otherwise all of them were kind benevolent masters? We got the samples of the slave masters of Astapor and Yunkai, and how they treat their slaves on an average day. And for that alone, they deserved punishment and suffering. They still profited immensely from slavery, no matter in how many pretzels you twist yourself.
So death by crucifixion is still a worthy punishment regardless of whether or not they are specifically culpable in this instance. And while that's actually a morally justified position to take, it still ignores the fundamental issue with Daenerys as a leader that these events killing them for, but wound up on the literal cross because they were not powerful enough for their compatriots to bother protecting them, or because someone with more sway or political acumen wanted them gone. Again, based on the fact that they have committed inhuman crimes, their deaths aren't exactly unfortunate. But purging an arbitrary amount of this social class and allowing the other criminals to decide who lives and who dies has some very obvious potential downsides. The consequences of this were also likely immediate as well as far-reaching, although Dany herself probably didn't recognize it. She largely seems to see Meereen as a trial run to figure out how she is going to rule Westeros, and she frankly doesn't do a very skilled job of ruling the Meereenese. However, it is possible, if not probable, that her initial actions towards the Meereenese slavers that she crucified had a strong influence on how the political situation she was dealing with actually unfolded. Ironically, by immediately killing a significant number of people who were in the ruling class of Meereen, she radically changed the political landscape of the city, and likely not in a way that was beneficial to her or Meereen as a whole. Clearly, no one in a position of power in Meereen could be considered a good person by today's standards, but given how resistant Meereen is to Dany's rule, it seems like a pretty safe bet that the masters who were offered forward as sacrifices would have included anyone who might have made her conquest easier. If there were anyone among them who supported Daenerys or had some kind of ethical agreement with her desire to revolutionize the slave cities, they ironically were almost certainly among those that the Meereenese offered up to be killed. So, while Dany's execution of the slave masters of Meereen isn't exactly morally objectionable, the issues that it presents for Meereen as a whole, as well as the problems that it exposes with Daenerys' ability to rule fairly and justly, are obvious. Except to Daenerys. Yes, she does express some misgivings about her decision to crucify them, but her understanding of the political implications or the injustice in her administration of the law are not a factor in her second-guessing whatsoever. Interestingly, it is mostly an emotional reaction that drives her to kill them, and it is mostly an emotional reaction that makes her regret killing them as well. Dani's emotional inner life is what makes her an appealing and relatable character, but it is also what exposes her as a very poor ruler.
So now you take a 15-year-old who had no formal education and was basically thrown into a leadership position and hold it against her that she had an emotional reaction against, wouldn't you know, 163 slave children being crucified as a mere display of power made specifically against her? I'm sure that if Sansa was in her place, she would make a feast for the slave masters, and with her power of deduction, she would distinguish who actually is the leader of the city, and then she would bow to them graciously and ask, please stop owning human beings, and they will be charmed by the power of her personal ivory steel skin. Yeah, do you think this is what would have happened? To me, Daenerys could have thrown them all into a meat grinder alive, and again, this is what I would have done in her position. A total purge of all slave master elements, through death or harsh re-education, and that is the only way forward with this, as history shows. The crucifixion of 163 children, while emotional, was also a display of power which planted the seeds of fear in the hearts of all the slave masters in that world. If I were a slave, I would be happy that I no longer have a literal owner, and I was freed, and I would not give a shit if he was thrown into a re-education camp or crucified. And wouldn't you know? And you know, the slaves literally don't care, and they see Daenerys as their savior. I am no lady, the widow replied. Just Vogaro's whore. You want to be gone from here before the tigers come. Should you reach your queen, give her a message from the slaves of old Volantis. She touched the faded scar upon her wrinkled cheek, where her tears had been cut away. Tell her we are waiting. Tell her to come soon. This is what this story focuses on so much. The issue of 163 slave masters is quickly dropped because it is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Moreover, it is when Daenerys starts making compromises with the slave masters that the freedmen become disillusioned with her to some extent. Daenerys Targaryen was wed. The guards on the pens had told them, laughing. She had taken a Meereenese slaver as her king, as wealthy as he was noble, and when the peace was signed and sealed, the fighting pits of Meereen would open once again. Other slaves insisted that the guards were lying, that Daenerys Targaryen would never make peace with slavers. Misa, they called her. Someone told him that meant mother. Soon the Silver Queen would come forth from her city, smash the Yunkai, and break their chains, they whispered to one another. Daenerys will deal with the slavers with fire and blood, as she should have all along, and this is what the freedmen want of her. Because violence is necessary in rooting out oppression, as we are shown countless times throughout history. Holding against Dany the fact that she reacted emotionally to torture while she isn't even legally an adult in the world that she lives is bizarre. It is once again grasping for straws and twisting the situation to show Dany in a more villainous light. And if that misreading of the text entails you quite literally defending people who profit off of selling human beings to be mutilated, castrated, raped, and dehumanized, and yet you defend those people because, what if some of them were not directly responsible? Why they profit off of selling people? The fundamental aspect of Dany's arc in Meereen is her realizing that oppression can only be destroyed with fire and blood, and that she simply wasted time by trying to make peace and compromises with these slavers. And you know, when in the winds of winter she burns Volantis, we will be cheering. And you know, when in the winds of winter she kills Illyrio Mopatis, we will be cheering. Because I have no compassion to slave owners, and because the life of a single slave has more value to me than all the slave masters in the world.
Wise views on Daenerys are hardly anything new. In fact, Dany Mad Queen tyrant theories have been popping ever since her first appearance in Game of Thrones. Some people make much bolder arguments, such as that Dany failed the slaver economy, and that's why she's destined to go evil, which is even worse. And Hills Alive's only saving grace is that she did not say this, but I'm sure she may think this deep inside. She just knows how to keep proper optics. In reality, Dany is doomed for this sort of argument being thrown towards her, for her arc being misread, for her being called a slaver in spite of herself being a 14-year-old bridal slave. No matter how mind-blowingly stupid your reading of her is, how far-fetched from her actual storyline and how big of a double standard you have to apply towards her, it will be accepted as fact and legitimate analysis, because people in A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, in particular, do not know how to create hypotheses. Instead of analyzing something and then coming to a conclusion, they first create a conclusion and then scramble the text to look for something justifying it. This is how we end with progressively more stupid theories. And while we are able to recognize that Tyrion the time-traveling fetus is a stupid theory, Mad Queen Dany is not considered as that, even though they were reached through exactly the same lens. If you approach Dany's arc with the assumption that everything she does is proof of her upcoming madness, then every single possible action of her, no matter how morally justified, heroic, or even just fucking normal, will be proof of it. If Dany bought the Unsullied, she would be called a slaver who does not care about the cost of her conquest. But when Dany did not pay for the Unsullied and instead killed their owner and freed them, she was called a tyrant. If she did not conquer Astapor and Yunkai, she would be called callous, not caring about all the slaves and only freeing those who offer something to her. But when she did conquer Astapor and Yunkai and inevitably made the mistakes along the way, she can only rule with fire and blood, and she can only be a conqueror, why, being an awful ruler, with no consideration for the fact that she isn't even legally an adult and never had a formal education. This is also why only Dany is held to this standard. Let us do a little experiment and approach Jon's arc with an assumption that he is the one going mad. In A Game of Thrones, he attacked Alistair Thorne with a knife. Imagine if Dany did it. We would not hear the end of it. He executes Janos Slynt without mercy. Wow, truly shows that he can only rule through terror. Wait, Jon Snow actually fully intends to purchase literal slaves. He is a slaver, and that proves that he is going insane. Clearly, it's only Daenerys that is a tyrant who is going to nuke a city and then be put down by her intimate lover, her dragons taken from her for someone more deserving, like young Riff, who is actually totally a real son of Rhaegar, because it is so compelling for him to be the real deal when he's a minor character in book 5 out of 7. Or Jon Snow, who is an honorable noble hero and whose Targaryen genes do not suddenly kick in for him to turn into a deranged tyrant. In reality, Mad Queen Dany is a really disappointing and not at all compelling narrative. House Targaryen ultimately falling is also not a compelling narrative. Because what compelling is in a teenage bridal slave making dragons from stone and bringing them back to the world in a miraculous event, only for those dragons to be put down 2 years later because they are a metaphor for nukes? Or for her dragons to be given to someone else like they are gifts when she was the one to walk into the fire and wake them from stone? What is compelling about Dany believing she is the last Targaryen, and then realizing that she is not, and that there is still hope for restoration of her family, if the Targaryens are meant to fall? These people actually want this story to be worse.